Welcome to the CEC Report for the 13th of January 2017. I'm Elisa Barwick, and joining me today is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we're discussing Join the Worldwide Campaign for Glass-Steagall, and our housing Ponzi scheme is coming down. So firstly today, Join the Worldwide Campaign for Glass-Steagall. Now, the majority of Australians may not have even heard of Glass-Steagall, and when you raise it to the man in the street, they often say, what? Mm-hmm. However, these two words behind which a crucial concept lies, which we'll elaborate today, may be what saves the lives of every average Australian in this coming period and perhaps this year, in fact.
Yeah, Elisa, I mean, Glass-Steagall, for the viewers who haven't heard of it, is a legislation that was brought in the 1930s by Franklin Roosevelt to deal with the two big to fail banks back then in the 1930s that were responsible for the Depression. And what Glass and Steagall did, they were congressmen, they put up legislation that Roosevelt signed into law after passing the Congress that separated out the big banks. It took the commercial necessary banking system that we need to have for our economy, the boring banking as we call it, you know, the mortgages, the loans and so forth, the banks that hold people's deposits, and they said that has to be completely separate from the merchant investment banking, insurance arms, stockbroking and so forth, so that these investment arms of the banks don't have access to depositors' funds. Now, since the deregulation of the banking system, particularly since the late 80s, early 90s, you've seen more and more deregulation, and in 1999 that Glass-Steagall legislation was repealed in the US and consequently and subsequently right throughout the world. So what you've had now is a build-up of these two big to fail banks that are absolutely stuffed chockers with derivatives and other speculative instruments. You know, derivatives are basically gambling instruments that the banks use to so-called mitigate risk and all sorts of excuses like that. But as you've seen across the world, you've seen the collapse of Greece in particular, you've seen the collapse of many countries, you know, the Ireland, for example, as a result of the build-up of this speculative activity. And here in Australia, we have the 4 or 5 too big to fail banks, which another term for this, as you might hear, is vertical integration, where you've had all these different other services piled onto this boring banking. Things like insurance, stockbroking, investment banking, merchant banking, and so forth. And the idea of a Glass-Steagall is to say, no, let us have the boring banking and let's protect that boring banking for the sake of the economy. And if people want to invest in the risky stuff like merchant banking, investment banking, well, that's fine, but the two have got to be separated.
Yeah.
And that's what Glass-Steagall means. That's what it's like a metaphor now for that process.
Exactly. And if under those conditions, under Glass-Steagall, if the investment banks that are gambling away quite happily, if they do lose everything, if they make a bad bet and they collapse, then the average person who didn't enter into any contract to gamble is safe. They're separated out.
And the government would guarantee and back up the boring commercial bankings as it should. It won't need to if it's properly regulated, but nonetheless, that is the most important part of the economy, not the speculative side.
Yeah. Now, of course, we've been pushing for Glass-Steagall for many years, but we launched a campaign late last year in particular to get it into this new parliament. And we had a petition called Australia, Break Up the Big Banks Now, Pass Glass-Steagall. And that is now, as well as on our website on change.org, which every time somebody signs that, sends a message through to all the leaders of the major parties, the Prime Minister and the relevant ministers. So people should go to change.org, search Glass-Steagall and sign on to that. Now, this year, we are determined to get that through, as well as bringing it back to the forefront in the United Kingdom, where it's had an enormous amount of support, and it nearly passed in 2013. And in fact, after Donald Trump's election, because he'd promised Glass-Steagall, Lord Stoddart actually raised Glass-Steagall to the government and said, what are you going to do about Glass-Steagall in the light of the fact that the US are now looking at it? Now, speaking of the US, there's a big campaign that has been launched there to hold Donald Trump to that promise, because no one really knows what Trump's going to do. Is he going to flinch on everything, or is he going to follow it up? And so there's an Ohio-initiated campaign which is organised by a group of generally Bernie Sanders supporters, actually, because he was a big supporter of Glass-Steagall. It's called Our Revolution in Northwest Ohio, and it's been supported by other major organisations, and they're grassroots type movements. So they've issued an open letter to Donald Trump, and it's headlined, "Make good on your campaign statement to support the Glass-Steagall Act." And I'll just read a couple of excerpts. It says, "As you take office, the conditions for a collapse are too similar to those of 2007. We applaud your campaign statement in Charlotte, North Carolina on October 26, 2016, endorsing a call for a 21st century version of Glass-Steagall. To set the tone of discourse in Congress 2017, we ask that you restate your support for a Glass-Steagall Act during your State of the Union address. Be assured in doing so you will find common ground with both the Republicans and the Democrats, since both party platforms have the support of banking legislation that separates insured accounts from Wall Street speculation in their respective platforms." So this is quite an important call, and in fact we're calling on people, and they're pushing for people across the world to sign on to this call, which you can find at the CEC website, to give a show of support, because essentially if Trump does follow through on this, politicians in the United Kingdom and in Australia who have been blocking moves or hedging their bets on implementation of Glass-Steagall will be forced to address the issue. And if it passes anywhere, really, Craig, the implication would be, if other countries didn't do it, the whole system would be collapsing around their ears.
Well, that's right, because you're talking about dealing with the too big to fail bank phenomenon, what hasn't been done since the global financial crisis, and there is no other solution. I mean, every action that's been taken by the Bank of International Settlements and the Financial Stability Board based at the Bank of International Settlements has failed. The bail-in operation has failed. The recent banks in Italy, for example, there was an intention of trying to bail them in, that is, steal people's deposits, but that hasn't been able to be implemented because politically, trying to steal people's deposits, which is the intention of the bankers, just won't work. So what's the solution? You have to separate out this monumental mountain of debt, say it is unpayable, and protect the local and necessary banking system. And here in Australia, we have trillions, trillions and trillions of dollars. I think it's $36 trillion of derivatives, and the notional capital value of derivatives, and they keep rising at the rate of something like $6 trillion a quarter. And this is the pure speculation that we have in the system, which back prior to the 1990s didn't exist. So, I mean, this is the nature of the current banking system. It's like a global casino, and it is in the process of disintegration as we speak. So we'll stop for a short break, but we'll come right back to this after the break and discuss a bit more of the detail of exactly why we're in a worse position than 2007, 2008. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing an international campaign for Glass-Steagall banking regulation. Now, we're going to just give a bit of a sense of where the financial system is at in the ongoing crash. Craig, you just mentioned the Italian banking crisis, which is probably a real trigger point for the moment. The Monte dei Paschi Bank, which is the oldest bank in the world and one of Italy's biggest banks, the crisis there, which is extremely grave, has not been resolved. Basically, at the end of the year, the government, as you said, refused to enact a bail-in, stealing depositors' money to save the bank, because they knew the political implications of that, because most of Italian bondholders who would lose their money are ordinary savers. That's where they put their savings typically over there. So instead the government said, we're going to nationalise the bank, which means basically a government bailout, and the European Central Bank said, well, fine, because they really couldn't do anything else. But they said, if you do a government bailout, the capital requirements we demand for the bank will be nearly double, basically. So they, instead of having to raise about $4 billion, they had to raise more than $8 billion to pull together. But what the Italians are beginning to do more and more, and we've seen it with various politicians and commentators that are coming out and saying, look, Italy's being made the scapegoat. Look at Deutsche Bank, look at the whole system. The original cause of the problems at the MPS Bank were because MPS bought a bank, Anton Veneta Bank, from Banco Santander and the Royal Bank of Scotland, which was a part of bailing out the global financial system post-2008. They paid more than double what they should have paid, and they got put into huge debt.
So now various leaders are saying, look, the non-performing loans of Italy's banking system is not the issue, it's the derivatives bubble, and unless you deal with that, there is no solution. Now, the other interesting thing that has just emerged is in a report from the Office of Financial Research in America, which is part of the US Treasury. They've revealed that the biggest US banks, the globally systemic ones, have an exposure of $2 trillion US dollars to the European banking system. And we'll put up a graphic which shows a lot of its derivatives, but it's all the same kind of dodgy dealings that got them into trouble, all the same kind of speculation in 2008. And one other warning was that the OECD has just put out a warning saying that the property bubble is another trigger point, that the overinflation of property prices could burst in the coming period, and we'll talk about that a bit more later in the next...
In some places it is bursting.
Because Australia actually is the one place where it didn't really burst already and it's dramatically overinflated. So we'll come back to that, but two warnings I wanted to mention, Craig, because more people are beginning to realise the scale of what we're looking at here. And there's a banker by the name of James Rickards who's just made such a warning. He was actually a lawyer for long-term capital management, which when it collapsed in 1998 nearly brought down the entire global financial system, which was admitted by leading people at the time. And so he would be in a position to know, and he's warning of a new crash of unprecedented scale and damage. And in an interview on the 26th of December with MarketWatch, he was asked, why do you believe a financial crisis is coming in 2018? And what do you see as the likely triggers? He said, a financial crisis is certainly coming. It could happen in 2018, 2019, or it could happen tomorrow. The conditions for collapse are all in place. And then he went on to say that the crisis is inevitable. And when asked if this was likely to be on the scale of the 2008 crisis, or the interviewer said, what is a better comparison? Rickards answered, the new crisis will be of unprecedented scale. This is because the system itself is of unprecedented scale and interconnectedness. And then he talked about the exponential growth in the system since 2008. And he said, this means that if you double the system, you do not double the risk. You increase it by a factor of 5 or 10. Since we have vastly increased the scale of the financial system since 2008, with larger banks, greater concentration of banking assets in fewer institutions, larger derivatives positions, and 70 trillion of new debt, we should expect the next crisis to be much worse than the last. There is no comparison short of wartime exigencies such as 1914. The next crisis will be of unprecedented scale and damage. Now, fortunately, Craig, he did say that his solution to this would be the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, breaking up big banks and banning derivatives. And he also talked about tougher law enforcement of bank wrongdoing. So this is basically what we have specified as well, Craig, to solve the system.
I think one of the things that there's no penalties these days for bankers and their activities. I mean, after the last global financial crisis, no Wall Street bankers were jailed for their role in the collapse, right? And that's the problem. There's a policy too big to jail. So consequently, the sort of behaviour that is by bankers, the sort of behaviour into speculation is sanctioned, it's protected, and they can get away with it until you start jailing bankers again, putting bankers in jail for fraud, which is what it is. Then this sort of behaviour is going to continue. So we take the position of what Ferdinand Pecora did in the Roosevelt period, where he actually was able to successfully jail some bankers and then establish the groundwork for Glass-Steagall, so that having a stable banking system, well regulated, is the norm. Not this deregulated crap that we've had, which has seen the potential destruction of many, many livelihoods into the future because of the collapse of the system.
And the alternative to having that kind of Glass-Steagall solution is not pretty, and that was pointed out by another financial expert, Ernst Wolf, who did an interview with Sputnik Deutschland. He said the collapse of Monte dei Paschi, the Italian bank, could bring on financial fascism, because he said, you know, any kind of pathway they're talking about of bail-in and bail-out won't solve the problem. it will just reappear and will be accompanied by popular uprising and social explosion. So he said bail-in will only be possible with the use of force against citizens, the reason why the police and the military are currently being deployed everywhere on the pretext of combating terrorism. He said if the deployment of police and military is not enough, the financial industry will be left with one possibility. It will abolish what remains of democracy and follow the route of fascism. And we've seen this historically in the 1920s, 1930s period, Craig, and we certainly don't want a repeat of it today.
Well, back in 2002, Elisa, that's now, 15 years ago, we put out a new citizen, Economic Development or Police State Fascism, which is looking at this exact same problem. Because back in 2002, under the leadership of physical economist Lyndon LaRouche, he was forecasting back then that the entire system would collapse, which it did do in 2007. So the only solution is to go with large-scale economic development, right? Go back to Glass-Steagall to start with, establish a national bank to create large amounts of credit and then spend that into the economy in large-scale infrastructure development and science driver projects. That's the solution. Now, we've not gone down that road in the last 15 years, so the problem's getting worse and worse and worse. And consequently, what you're seeing is this development of police state fascism. All the terrorism laws that were introduced by Howard in 2001 were not done to combat terrorism, but were done for exactly the reason you just said, to control the population in times of economic upheaval.
Yep.
And that's the nature of how the financial oligarchy is looking at the world today. They're looking at trying to control the livelihoods of people through police state fascism measures because they don't want to lose control of their financial system.
Yep. Now people can ring in on our toll-free number and get a copy of our Australian Alert Service, a free copy, to find out more about those subjects. And after the break we're going to talk more, focus in on the Australian housing bubble and the implications of that collapsing. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Our housing Ponzi scheme is coming down. So now we get to discuss the implosion of the property bubble. And as I just mentioned, this is being warned of not only by the OECD, many voices have been warning for some time that the Australian property bubble is going to burst, and there's been coverage of the Australian situation across the world just recently. Now, there's a major report that just came out on the Western Australian housing collapse from LF Economics, and it says that property investors are losing wealth and income by the day. It says property investors cannot borrow against lost equity, and their Ponzi finance schemes are struck firmly in reverse gear. And so basically you've had, in 2016, house prices dropped by 4.3% in Perth and 7% in the rest of the state, and there's an exodus of people flowing out of Western Australia as a result. Now Brisbane, there's another case study coming from Montgomery Investment Management in a video called Property Implosion, and they talk about the amount of new construction around 5 kilometres of the CBD of Brisbane, where you've had in the first 9 months of last year, over 5,000 new apartments, which when they came on the market, vacancy rates doubled, but there's 13,000 more to be completed in the next 18 months. So it's going to cause that to follow the pathway of Perth. But Sydney, of course, is the big one, Sydney and Melbourne. And we'll just focus on Sydney because there's reports from Core Logic, which is a property analyst group, and a number of very useful graphics. But prices in Sydney have risen by 15.5% last year. Melbourne prices rose 13.7%. The prices in Sydney have actually doubled since 2009. And we'll put up the first graph, which you can see here. It shows the red are the houses worth over $1 million in Sydney, on the left are the houses, I should say, and then on the right are the units. So the units are slightly better than the houses, but as you can see, to buy a house in Sydney, Craig, $1 million is the new standard. Obviously there's a lot that are over $1 million as well in various parts.
Yeah, that's the same in Melbourne as well, at least in many places now in Melbourne. So Melbourne and Sydney are on a par, although Sydney's just a little bit ahead. Yeah,
you don't have to live in a highfalutin suburb. No. They're just regularly, $1 million for virtually nothing. And then if we look at the next graph, Here you can see the change from December 2011 in the median house prices in Sydney again. So on the left you've got December 2011, on the right you've got December 2016, and you can see that that $1 million price tag has gone from, you know, a smattering to covering last year most of Sydney and surrounds.
And this is the median house price, which means some are slightly lower, others are much higher. So
yeah,
it really does show you the big, and this is only in 5 years, right? This is not over 25 years, but just 5 years. So this shows you the growth in the bubble, and it is a bubble.
And this next graphic is from Pete Wargent, Australian finance company. This shows the average mortgage size from 2012 to the end of 2016, and it's shown state by state. So New South Wales is the one on the left, Victoria, Queensland, WA, South Australia, NT. But yeah, you can see here this spread of $1 million properties is driven by debt, and you can see the increase in each case of the mortgages that people are carrying.
Yeah, in September 2012, you can see in Sydney, for example, New South Wales, the average mortgage was about $455,000. Today it's $605,000.
Yeah, and this next graphic, these are from a report from LF Economics from November last year. And this one shows how long it will actually take people to save a deposit. It takes around 9 years, whereas in 1975 it took only 3 years to save your deposit.
That's 20% of the value of a house, a deposit.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then on the next graphic, the median price to income ratio, which shows, you know, around how many times your annual income, how many years it would take you to actually pay off your house, or it takes around 12 times the amount, I should say, of your annual income now, and that's an average 12 times your annual income to pay off your house. I believe in some places there's up to 30 times or so your income to actually buy a house, and of course many people will not pay it off in their lifetime. Now, of course, this means that the East Coast is going to follow the West, because look at our economy here. We're shutting down, you know, our power production, we're shutting down car production, manufacturing. How can it not? This is a bubble, it has to come down, and it's already started coming down.
Well, you're looking at the the ratio of median incomes to the price of housing. When the incomes start to fall because people are unemployed, and there's been reports of unemployment increasing steadily over the next several years because of the shutdown of industry, that directly is going to affect how much people can pay for housing. Add to that the glut of things like flats, and particularly around Docklands here in Melbourne, there's thousands of these empty apartments that haven't even been built yet that are going to come onto the market. So you're going to see people. Why would people buy an apartment today when they think the price is going to come down in 5 years' time or 2 or 3 years' time? So this downward pressure is going to begin to accelerate, and people are going to, as they lose their jobs, they're simply not going to invest in housing. And the whole bubble, where the banks are exposed to because of the way that their assets are tied up in mortgages, is going to put real pressures on the banks. Yeah,
60% of our banks' lending is in mortgages, in what has become a vast speculative scheme to generate profit and money to keep the system going, since it was, narrowly saved in 2008. So there's no way they're going to save it. We need Glass-Steagall. That's the final word on it.
We need national banking. We need large-scale infrastructure development to really stimulate the economy and create a lot more productive jobs that actually produce real wealth.
So go to our website and sign our Glass-Steagall petition and get involved. Thanks for tuning in, and join us again next week.